true.
Did you see the BBC reporting on this the other day that said we couldn't actually find an organised central control nexus for the far right? And that's why lots of people participating were over 60s, children and members of the local community. So they're almost scratching their head at how, quote, anarchic it was. And it just shows there isn't, unlike the Socialist Workers' Party or Stand Up to Racism, a central organising body for this. It's just local people being outraged about mass immigration and what they see as the privileging of outsider communities and Islam in the legal system above their interests.
Yeah. So I think I think there was some data about the initial wave of arrests showing that most people arrested were in fact locals and only a minority from outside the areas where the disorder was happening. So Keir Starmer effectively, whether knowingly or not, has trafficked in misinformation about who is involved in the rioting and who is organising, instigating the rioting. And by saying it's people from outside your area, far-right, anti-Muslim activists from outside your area that are coming in to attack mosques and attack Muslims, that effectively triggered local Muslim populations in those areas to organise counter-protests. And during those counter-protests, crimes were committed. You know, people identified as far-right protesters were hunted down and attacked. The police, in some cases, were attacked. So you could argue that Keir Starmer himself is guilty of a criminal offence under the Online Safety Act, the criminal offence that he's urging the authorities to prosecute people for. He knowingly trafficked in false information, which definitely caused physical harm. I mean, it shows you really that, terms like misinformation and disinformation, calculating whether they caused harm, is so nebulous and subjective and imprecise that it makes no more sense to prosecute someone like the 55-year-old woman from Cheshire than it does the Home Secretary or the Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed. But I suppose one problem there, of course, is that the technically written letter of the law generally matters much less than the people who wield it and the people who are in possession of the system more broadly. And given that, for want of a better word, people on our side don't have that sort of power and therefore are not well positioned to try and make sure that the law is applied in a maximally impartial way, how do we get around that difficulty?
Well, I think it is a difficulty that the government is unwilling to acknowledge, let alone do anything about. But I think this perception has grown up, completely understandably, that we have a two-tier criminal justice system in this country. And people who are perceived as enemies of the regime are much more severely dealt with than others in kind of designated, sacralized minority groups. It's the quiet part was said out loud in one particular courtroom. The BBC reported that a man was arrested in Nottinghamshire. Initially, I think, didn't enter a plea, but then pleaded guilty and was sent down for 3 years. And one of the things he pleaded guilty to, according to this BBC report, was anti-establishment rhetoric. Yes. I mean, it's sort of comically kind of blatant, isn't it? They don't usually say the quiet part out loud. And Reuters have subsequently done a fact check in which they've said the BBC, without being too hard on the BBC, have effectively said, no, this is misinformation put out by the BBC. That wasn't actually one of the charges. That's not a criminal offence. Yeah. But clearly, the recorder, someone, wearing a wig in that courtroom, used that phrase, which was quoted by the BBC.
And you get these mask-off moments. So even when someone is technically on trial for an incitement to violence charge or an incitement to racial hatred charge, and potentially the criteria are genuinely met, the judges will still filter their verdict in many cases with language which has no bearing on the elements of the crime. So they won't just say, you did fulfill this element of the crime, you did fulfill that element of the crime in a dispassionate way. They'll say things like, people with abhorrent views like yours have no place in a civilized and democratic society. Like, that is a mask-off moment where you realize that magistrates, I'm sure, do their best to do their jobs, but they are human beings and they're just as prone to certain forms of cultural and ideological capture as anyone else. And under our woke moral order, treating people unequally in order to make them more equal is just taken as an axiomatic value. For many of these people, it is the moral equivalent of being against kicking kittens in the face. So they don't actually think of themselves as acting in an ideological fashion when they do that sort of thing. And so it goes to show how a system which is, we're told, is what has historically been the envy of the world, our sort of Rolls-Royce impartial justice system, is prone to corruption and really depends on the people who constitute it.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, a good example of how captured the kind of lower levels of the courts and tribunal service was the initial response to Maya Forstatter's claim in the employment tribunal when she lost her job.
Can you remind viewers of this case? Because I've forgotten it myself.
Is a feminist who was employed by, I think it was a legal charity.
Okay.
She is a gender critical feminist and had challenged gender identity ideology in a fairly robust way. But I don't think she'd actually misgendered any of her work colleagues. Misgendered, I mean,
God forbid,
called them by the correct gender. She brought a case against her employer claiming unfair dismissal, and she argued that under the Equality Act, her philosophical belief in the biological reality of sex should be a protected belief, and therefore firing her for expressing that belief was discrimination. The initial verdict of the tribunal panel was that believing in the biological reality of sex isn't a belief worthy of respect in a democratic society.
They use that language all the time.
I mean, that's known as the Granger test.
Yes.
And to be fair to the Courts and Tribunal Service, she appealed, and the Employment Appeals Tribunal overruled that judgment and said, actually, no, believing in the biological reality of sex is worthy of respect in a democratic society, and it thereafter became a protected belief under the Equality Act. But the initial response was absolutely extraordinary and shows the extent to which the lower sections of the tribunal service, anyway, have been completely captured. And we know they're captured because, organizations like Stonewall and Gendered Intelligence and all kinds of, diversity grifters are employed to provide training to magistrates, members of tribunal panels, and so forth, and the police. They're completely pickled in this ideology.
It's also worthy of note on the idea that you bring in the grievance industrial complex to brainwash various politicians, civil servants, and magistrates, that in the immediate aftermath of the Black Lives Matter protests, riots in the US, that were very disorderly, attempting to set fire to the cenotaph, and had massive fights in Newcastle in the UK, that not only did nobody do jail time on the side of the, actually, I think one person did in Newcastle, one South African gentleman who was very drunk at the London protest did, so I will correct myself on that. Very few people did actual jail time and were prosecuted for the protest, but Keir Starmer not only took the knee, then did a down camera thing saying that the grievances of the protesters were legitimate, unlike those in Southport, and then committed to have the entire Labour Party undergo unconscious bias training to ensure that they were ideologically primed to be in favour of the likes of Black Lives Matter and against the rioters he has since designated as far right.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's becoming increasingly apparent, I had a kind of revelation when watching the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics, in which there was the much discussed sort of pastiche of the Last Supper, and lots of drag queens and trans models and so forth participating in the opening ceremony, and Macron proudly tweeting, "This is France."
Yes.
And what I think the revelation I had is that we are living in a kind of secular theocracy, in which, like Iran, the regime identifies and gets its legitimacy in part from particular moral values, which it robustly upholds. And if you don't subscribe to that morality, and it is the morality of, radical progressive ideology, then you are considered more or less an enemy of the state. And, things like the presumption of innocence, unless you remind them, are not usually extended to you. I came up with this phrase, which was, we're living in a kind of technocratic theocracy. And that's true not just of France, it's true of Britain too. It's true of America under Biden, and will be true of America under Kamala Harris, in which it's a kind of potent cocktail of technocratic managerialism and radical progressive ideology. And I think to the people who are kind of marinated in it, as you said, they don't think of it as politically contentious. They don't think of themselves as ideologues or as subscribing to a contentious, narrow ideological dogma. They just think of it as kind of common sense, as straightforwardly moral, righteous. And somehow it's all mixed up. The idea that you can be unburdened by doctrine and at the same time immediately blame, spontaneous eruptions of discontent about mass migration on the far right, without thinking of that as, politically contentious. I mean, it's part of this kind of, I think this kind of technocratic, theocratic kind of, that's what these regimes are across the West, and increasingly becoming so. And I think one of the reasons Keir Starmer was so quick to blame misinformation and disinformation on social media, one of the reasons the Digital Services Act was passed in the European Union, one of the reasons for the hostility to Elon Musk is that social media is a vehicle for the expression of dissent from this rather narrow set of technocratic, radically progressive values, and they're not at all inhibited about advertising their hostility to dissenters and seeking to punish them in various ways. I mean, I think what's been disturbing about the response of the authorities to the recent disturbances is that hitherto, if you said something heretical on social media, you could risk being cancelled, maybe placed under investigation at work, losing your job. You could lose your social media account, or it could be temporarily closed, but you are unlikely to end up in jail. I mean, in a few cases, there have been kind of high-profile examples of people who've been prosecuted, like the Finnish parliamentarian for challenging, radical progressive dogma on LGBT rights.
Quoting the Bible in the process, yes.
Exactly.
Or even Count Dankula posting an edgy joke back on YouTube.
A few isolated examples.
Yes.
But for the most part, you didn't have to worry about being sent to prison if you challenged kind of technocratic theocracy on social media. Now I think you do.